In the shadow of Silicon Valley's gleaming campuses, beneath the polished glass and the endless hum of innovation, there lies a secret so vast, so meticulously engineered, that it rivals the greatest financial mysteries of the modern age. This is not a story of code or circuitry. This is not a tale of iPhones or app stores. This is the story of how one company, the most valuable enterprise in human history, quietly moved $250 billion beyond the reach of nations, beyond the grasp of tax collectors, beyond the understanding of the public that made it rich. $250 billion, hidden, accumulated, shielded, for years. It happened not through crime in the traditional sense, but through architecture, through law firms in tuxedos, through parliamentary loopholes carved in the dead of night, through a labyrinth of shell companies with no employees, no offices, no purpose other than to exist on paper and hold money that no government could touch. It began innocently enough, the way all great deceptions do. In the early 1980s, a young Apple computer, still finding its footing in a garage-born revolution, needed to sell Macintosh computers in Ireland. Europe was hungry for American technology, and Ireland, desperate for jobs and foreign investment, offered something no other country would: a tax rate so low it was almost fictional. 12.5% on paper. In reality, far less. Apple arrived. Factories rose. Jobs followed. And then, quietly, the real work began. By the late 1980s, Apple's tax attorneys, working alongside a small circle of the world's most discreet advisors, discovered something extraordinary. Irish law contained a mismatch, a glitch, a contradiction so subtle that only the sharpest minds would ever see it. Under Irish rules, a company could be managed and controlled from California, yet be considered a tax resident nowhere at all. Stateless, a ghost in the machine of global finance. All it required was a signature in Dublin, a board meeting in Cupertino, and the willingness to never quite tell the full truth. And so Apple did what no company had done at that scale before. It created a creature of pure tax alchemy, Apple Sales International. On paper, ASI was an Irish company. In reality, it owned the rights to Apple's intellectual property across Europe, Asia, Africa, and the Middle East. Every iPhone sold in Paris, every MacBook purchased in Mumbai, every song downloaded in Cape Town, the profits flowed to ASI. But because ASI was managed from California, Ireland said it wasn't Irish. And because its only function was to hold intangible assets, the United States, under rules written for a pre-digital age, said it wasn't American either. The money belonged nowhere, and nowhere meant no tax. For decades, this structure lay buried beneath layers of corporate filings, obscured by the brilliance of Apple's public story. While the world celebrated the return of Steve Jobs, launch of the iPod, the unveiling of the iPhone, something else was growing in silence. A mountain of cash, untaxed, unseen. By 2014, the hoard had reached proportions that defied comprehension. $252 billion, according to the company's own admissions. Enough to fund entire nations. Enough to erase the national debt of Portugal twice over. Enough to give every American household nearly $2,000 and still have billions left over. But this was not greed in the cartoonish sense. It was not a villain twirling a mustache in a boardroom. It was colder, more clinical. It was the logical endpoint of a system that rewarded brilliance in exploitation as much as brilliance in design. Apple's leaders did not break the law. They mastered it. They turned compliance into a weapon, and they did it with the Apple way, elegantly, relentlessly, and always one step ahead of anyone trying to follow the trail. Yet no empire of secrecy lasts forever. In 2013, a Senate subcommittee, led by a soft-spoken senator from Michigan and a fiery elder statesman from Arizona, dragged Apple's tax practices into the light. Tim Cook sat before the world, calm and unflinching, and told Congress that Apple paid every dime it owed, every single one. The senators were unconvinced. The hearing became legend. The phrase offshore profit shifting entered the public lexicon, and for the first time, the world glimpsed the scale of what had been built. But even then, the full truth remained hidden. The real architecture, the true genius of the structure, lay deeper, in the Cayman Islands, in Jersey, in the Netherlands, and most crucially, in a second Irish miracle that would not be exposed until a whistleblower in Luxembourg and then investigative journalists across Europe began connecting dots no one else had seen. The story was just beginning. What Apple had built was not merely a tax strategy, it was a shadow economy, a parallel financial universe where the rules of nations simply did not apply. And for years, it worked perfectly. Until it didn't. The year is 2007. The iPhone is unveiled in San Francisco to thunderous applause. And somewhere, in the quiet corridors of Apple's tax department, a celebration of a different kind is taking place. Not with champagne, but with spreadsheets. Because in that moment, as the world fixates on a slab of glass and aluminum, the real revolution begins. Every unit sold outside the Americas will generate profit that flows through a pipeline so clean, so frictionless, that almost none of it will ever be taxed by any country on Earth. Apple Sales International, the stateless entity born 2 decades earlier, is about to become the most profitable company no one has ever heard of. By 2011, ASI alone records profits larger than the gross domestic product of Ecuador, larger than the combined profits of Google, Microsoft, and Intel in many years. And yet, it has no employees, no physical presence beyond a brass plaque on a law firm's door in Cork. Its only job is to buy the economic rights to Apple's inventions from another Apple entity in Cupertino, then sell those inventions to Apple subsidiaries around the world at an enormous markup. The profit margin approaches 100%. The tax rate approaches 0. How? Because Ireland, in its hunger to keep Apple happy, grants the company a private deal. A deal so secret that even senior officials in the Irish government are not fully briefed. In conference rooms closed to the public, tax executives negotiate a rate that is not 12.5%, not 5%, not even 2%. The effective rate on hundreds of billions in profit settles, according to later testimony, somewhere around 0.02%. 2 cents on every $1,000. A rounding error. A whisper. Apple will later claim this deal was perfectly legal, that Ireland offered it willingly, that every other company would have done the same. And, in a narrow sense, they are right. But the scale is the scandal. No other company has ever extracted profit from the entire non-American world and funneled it through a single entity that exists only on paper. No other company has ever convinced a sovereign nation to effectively subsidize its global dominance by surrendering nearly all claim to the wealth created on its soil. By 2012, the offshore cash pile has grown so large that it becomes a problem of physics. There is literally nowhere on Earth to park $200 billion without moving markets. Apple begins lending money to itself, shifting funds between subsidiaries in circles so complex that only a handful of people on the planet understand the full map. The company issues bonds in dollars, euros, yen, Swiss francs, Australian dollars, not because it needs money, but because it has too much. Investors line up to lend money to the richest company in history, and Apple uses the proceeds to buy back its own stock, driving the share price ever higher, rewarding executives, enriching shareholders, and further distancing the fortune from any tax authority that might dare to claim a piece. Inside Apple's Cupertino headquarters, the tax team operates like a skunkworks project. They report directly to the chief financial officer. Their work is compartmentalized. Even senior engineers working on the next iPhone have no idea how the profits from their labor are spirited away. The culture is one of disciplined silence. When employees leave, they sign agreements that follow them for life. The offshore structure is referred to only in code. Employees speak of the Irish guys or the Cork entity, the way intelligence operatives once spoke of Berlin safe houses. Meanwhile, the United States Treasury watches helplessly. American law, written in the age of steel and railroads, has no mechanism to tax profits that are earned abroad and never brought home. Lawmakers rage on television about corporate greed, but behind closed doors, they confess the system is broken. Both parties have accepted hundreds of millions in campaign contributions from the technology industry. Reform bills die quietly in committee. The loopholes remain open. The money keeps flowing. And Ireland, for its part, clings to Apple like a life raft. The company directly employs only a few thousand people in Cork, but the prestige of hosting Apple's European headquarters is incalculable. Politicians boast of it on the campaign trail. When journalists ask uncomfortable questions about the secret tax deals, they're accused of treason against Irish jobs. But cracks are forming. In Brussels, a soft-spoken Danish woman named Margrethe Vestager is rising through the ranks of the European Commission. She has no army, no police force, only the power of competition law. And she is beginning to look at state aid, the subsidies given by another name, with new eyes. In Washington, a senator named Carl Levin is preparing what will become the most watched congressional investigation of the decade. And in the offshore world itself, a tremor runs through the law firms and trust companies that have grown fat on Apple's business. Because for the first time, someone is following the money all the way down. The empire of untaxed billions is about to face its first real test. May 20th, 2013. The Senate Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations releases its memorandum, 240 pages of quiet fury. The title is simple, almost clinical: Offshore Profit Shifting and the U.S. Tax Code. But the target is unmistakable. Apple stands alone on the cover page, its logo reproduced in stark black and white, as though the committee staff wanted the world to see the fruit before it saw the rot. The next morning, the hearing room is packed. Cameras from every network crowd the back wall. Tim Cook enters wearing the same expression he wears on stage for product launches: calm, slightly amused, untouchable. He is flanked by lawyers who have rehearsed every possible question for months. Across the dais sit Carl Levin and John McCain. One is methodical, the other volcanic. Together, they represent the last generation of American politicians who still believe the tax code should apply to everyone. Levin begins with a statement that lands like a gavel. Between 2009 and 2012, he says, Apple avoided $44 billion in United States taxes through offshore entities that have no employees, no physical presence, and no tax residency anywhere on Earth. He calls the structure the holy grail of tax avoidance. The phrase will be repeated on every front page tomorrow. Cook does not flinch. He thanks the committee for its work. He says Apple is the largest taxpayer in America, the largest in the world. He says the company has done nothing illegal. He says the Senate should fix the tax code instead of blaming the companies forced to live under it. The room is silent except for the clicking of shutters. McCain leans forward and calls the testimony one of the most outrageous examples of tax avoidance I have ever seen. Cook smiles thinly and says Apple does not use gimmicks. The hearing lasts 5 hours. No one storms out. No one raises their voice. Yet something irreversible happens. The spell is broken. For the first time, ordinary citizens hear the numbers spoken aloud. 70% of Apple's global profits booked in Ireland, an effective tax rate of less than 2% on tens of billions. A subsidiary with no employees earning $74 billion in profit over 4 years. The statistics feel impossible, like discovering a second Pacific Ocean hidden under the first. The world reacts with a mixture of awe and revulsion. Protesters gather outside Apple stores holding signs that read, "Pay your fair share." Late-night hosts devote entire monologues to the hearing. In Europe, finance ministers who have spent years courting American tech giants suddenly discover the language of moral outrage. In Ireland, the government issues a statement defending its tax regime while quietly beginning to panic. Apple's stock barely moves. Investors shrug. The company is too big, too essential, too beloved. The iPhone 5S is months away. The cash pile keeps growing. Nothing, it seems, can slow the machine. But across the Atlantic, Margrethe Vestager is watching the hearing on a laptop in her Brussels office. She has been competition commissioner for less than a year. She is polite, precise, almost shy in public. Behind closed doors, she is relentless. She has already begun requesting documents from Dublin. She wants to know exactly what Ireland promised Apple in those secret meetings. She wants to know why a country that cannot afford to fix its own hospitals effectively waived taxes on hundreds of billions in profit. Her staff works in silence for 3 more years. They trace money through the Dutch sandwich, through Luxembourg financing companies, through Bermuda reinsurance shells. They map the double Irish in forensic detail, how 2 Irish companies are used to move profits to a head office that exists only in corporate filings. They discover that even after the Senate hearing, even after the global outcry, Apple continued to refine the structure, shaving basis points here, adding new layers there, always staying one step ahead. By 2016, the investigation is complete. The European Commission announces its decision on August 30th, in a small press room that cannot contain the journalists who show up. Vestager stands at the podium and delivers the verdict in her calm Copenhagen accent. Ireland, she says, granted illegal state aid to Apple. The effective tax rate was not just low, it was artificially, illegally suppressed. The benefit amounted to 13 billion euros in back taxes, plus interest. The number is so large it momentarily stuns the room. 13 billion euros, more than Ireland's annual health budget, more than the cost of bailing out its banks in the crash. Vestager says the money must be recovered immediately. Ireland's finance minister appears on television that same afternoon and says his country will appeal. Apple says it will appeal. The Prime Minister calls the decision baffling. For a moment, it looks as though Europe has finally drawn a line in the sand, only to watch both the company and the member state refuse to step over it. But the line has been drawn all the same. The age of absolute impunity is ending. The appeal takes years. It always does when the stakes are measured in nations. While lawyers file mountains of paper in Luxembourg courtrooms, the 13 billion euros sits untouched in an escrow account, earning interest for no one. A frozen monument to a war no one wants to admit is being fought. Apple does not wait. The company has already begun to dismantle the very structure that made it untouchable. In 2015, quietly, almost politely, Ireland closes the loophole that allowed stateless companies to exist. The double Irish is scheduled for extinction. Newcomers are barred immediately. Existing players, Apple chief among them, are granted a grace period that runs to 2020. The message is clear. The party is ending, but the guest of honor may stay until the lights come on. So Apple builds a new palace before the old one is torn down. In 2017, the company moves the residency of its crown jewels, the intellectual property that generates almost all non-American profit, to the British Channel Island of Jersey. Jersey has no corporate income tax on foreign earnings. Jersey asks no questions. Jersey is only too happy to become the new nowhere. Billions in profit continue to flow untaxed, now under a structure lawyers call the Green Jersey. The cash pile swells past 300 billion. At the same time, something unexpected happens in Washington. Donald Trump wins the presidency, promising to bring money home. In December 2017, Congress passes the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, the most sweeping overhaul of the corporate code in a generation. The old worldwide system is dead. In its place comes a territorial model with a twist. A one-time repatriation tax on offshore profits, set at 15.5% on cash and 8% on illiquid assets. For Apple, the bill comes to $38 billion, the largest single tax payment in history. Tim Cook calls it a historic opportunity. Shareholders cheer. The company announces a $250 billion capital return program, the biggest in corporate history. Stock buybacks accelerate. Dividends flow. The narrative shifts overnight. Apple is no longer hiding money. It is bringing it home like a dutiful son. The $38 billion paid, the headlines read, case closed. But the math tells a different story. Before the tax cut, Apple's offshore hoard was taxed at 0. After the cut, it is taxed at an effective blended rate far below 8% because most of the money is classified as illiquid intellectual property. The true cost to Apple is closer to $20 billion, maybe less. The company saves hundreds of billions compared to what it would have owed under the old rules. The repatriation is not a punishment. It is the final act of a decades-long heist, the moment the thieves are allowed to keep the loot in exchange for a modest finder's fee. And still, the money keeps coming. Even after Jersey, even after the tax reform, new streams open. Apple negotiates fresh deals with Ireland under the new rules, this time public, this time only 15%, but routed through structures that defer payment almost indefinitely. The company begins shifting legal ownership of its IP back to the United States, but only after extracting every last drop of benefit from the offshore system. The process will take years. The tax bills will remain theoretical. In Cupertino, the tax team receives quiet promotions. No one is fired, no one apologizes. The culture of genius extends to the balance sheet as much as to the product line. Employees still speak of the Irish structures in hushed tones. The way veterans speak of lost wars, they nevertheless believe they won. By 2020, the world has moved on. A pandemic grips the planet. iPhone sales soar as locked-down humanity reaches for connection. Apple's market value crosses $2 trillion. The 13 billion euro case is still on appeal. Most people have forgotten it ever happened. The escrow account now holds more than 16 billion with interest, money that belongs, in theory, to the citizens of Europe, yet remains untouched. And then, in July 2020, the General Court of the European Union delivers its judgment. In a ruling that shocks Brussels, the court annuls Vestager's decision. The Commission, it says, failed to prove that Ireland gave Apple selective treatment. The 13 billion euros is released back to Apple. Ireland, still appealing his own victory, breathes a sigh of relief it will never admit. Vestager stands before the press and promises to fight on. But the momentum is gone. The old world has beaten the new. Apple issues a short statement. We're glad to put this behind us. The money never leaves the bank. It was never in danger of leaving. The greatest tax avoidance machine in history has survived its closest brush with accountability. But survival is not the same as victory. Something has changed. The secrecy is gone. The architecture is exposed. The world now knows exactly how the trick was done. And the trick can never be performed the same way again. The lights do not come on all at once. They flicker, then spread. In 2021, a soft-spoken economist from Berkeley named Gabriel Zuckman publishes a paper that lands like an aftershock. Using leaked corporate filings and reconstructed profit flows, Zuckman calculates that between 2004 and 2022, Apple shifted roughly $630 billion in profit to zero-tax or near-zero-tax jurisdictions. $630 billion. The number is so large it feels fictional, yet the footnotes are meticulous. The paper is peer-reviewed, then weaponized. Overnight, it becomes the new baseline for every activist, every finance minister, every journalist who ever felt the 13 billion euro verdict was too small. Apple never comments directly. Instead, the company does something more powerful. It changes the subject. In September 2021, Tim Cook takes the stage in the Steve Jobs Theater and announces that Apple will invest $100 billion in American manufacturing, research, and supplier networks over 5 years. The headlines write themselves. Apple, the patriotic titan, the job creator, the company that learned its lesson and came home. The Zuckman paper disappears from the evening news, but the ground keeps shifting beneath them. In Paris, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development has spent a decade negotiating what was once considered impossible, a global minimum tax. 15%. Modest on paper, revolutionary in practice. 136 countries signed the accord in October 2021. Ireland signs last, under intense pressure, its 12.5% rate now a relic. Jersey, the Caymans, Bermuda, all the old havens are dragged into the net. The agreement contains a clause written with Apple specifically in mind. Any company earning more than 750 million euros in revenue will have its profits reallocated according to where its customers live, not where its lawyers filed the papers. Apple's tax department works through Christmas 2021. Spreadsheets replace holiday parties. The old world is collapsing in real time. The new structures must be ready before the rules take effect in 2024. Intellectual property is quietly moved again, this time to mainland United States entities. Costs are inflated in high-tax countries. New licensing agreements are drafted that look almost normal, almost taxable. The cash pile, now approaching $400 billion, even after years of buybacks, is slowly, methodically brought onshore. Not out of patriotism, out of inevitability. In 2022, Ireland finally closes the last grandfather clause. The double Irish dies at midnight on December 31st. No ceremony, no obituary, just a line in the Finance Act that no one outside the Cork law firms even notices. The brass plaques are removed from the doors in Hollyhill. Apple Operations Europe and Apple Sales International continue to exist, but their profits are now taxed at 12.5%, soon 15%. The golden age is over. Yet the money already extracted remains untouched. The $600 billion that flowed through the machine over 2 decades sits in United States government bonds, in corporate debt, in stock buybacks that can never be clawed back. No court has jurisdiction over profits legally earned under laws that no longer exist. The heist was perfect because it ended exactly when it had to. By 2023, Apple's effective worldwide tax rate creeps above 20% for the first time in decades. Analysts call it a tragedy. Shareholders shave a few points off the stock price. Cook tells CNBC the company will always pay what it owes, no more, no less. The phrase has become scripture inside one Apple Parkway. And still, the world buys iPhones. Still, the lines form on launch day. Still, the market capitalization climbs toward $3 trillion. The public memory is short, the brand immaculate. The tax scandal feels like ancient history, something that happened to a different company in a different moral universe. But there are places where memory is long. In university lecture halls, Zuckman's students run new models showing that the global minimum tax, even fully implemented, will raise Apple's bill by only a few $1 billion a year. In Brussels, Vestager's successors open fresh investigations into the Jersey years. In Washington, a new generation of congressional staffers drafts legislation that would treat controlled foreign corporations as domestic if they are managed from the United States, retroactively. The bills die quietly, killed by lobbyists who still carry Apple's card. The empire of untaxed billions has not vanished. It has merely changed shape. The money is home now, invested in America, taxed at American rates. But the architecture, this brilliant, does not simply retire. It evolves. And somewhere in Cupertino, in offices without windows, a small team is already designing the next shelter, because the game never ends. It only changes rules. The year is 2025. The Apple campus at night looks like a ring-shaped spaceship that has landed gently on the California earth. Inside its glass walls, the corridors are quiet, the lights dimmed to a soft lunar glow. Yet somewhere deep in the financial wing, servers hum with models that will not be shown to shareholders for another decade. The tax team is smaller now, only a dozen people instead of 50, but they are paid more than most vice presidents. Their mandate has not changed. Find the gap, widen it, make it beautiful. The world believes the story ended with a satisfying arc. The brazen offshore era, the Senate hearing, the European crusade, the repatriation, the global minimum tax, the quiet surrender. A morality play in 6 acts. But that is the public version, the one told in documentaries and undergraduate seminars. The private version is simpler. Apple never surrendered. It waited. It adapted. It won. Today, the $250 billion that once lived in nowhere has been laundered into the safest asset on Earth, Apple itself. Every share buyback between 2018 and 2024 transferred wealth from the corporate treasury to shareholders at a tax cost far lower than any government confiscation would ever have been. The executives who designed the offshore system cashed in their stock options at peaks no one dreamed possible in the garage days. The early employees, the geniuses who wrote the code and soldered the boards, became paper billionaires. The untaxed profits of the iPhone age did not disappear. They became the foundation of a new American aristocracy, one that wears hoodies and quotes Zen koans while owning more wealth than most nation-states. And the governments? They collected crumbs. The United States received its $38 billion and declared victory. Europe clawed back nothing. Ireland kept the jobs and the prestige and quietly thanked Apple for making its economy relevant. The global minimum tax, now in force, adds perhaps $4 or $5 billion a year to Apple's bill, less than the company spends on one season of Apple TV Plus originals. The machinery was too elegant to destroy. It simply migrated upward, into the cloud of financial abstraction where nation-states cannot follow. New patents are filed in Singapore at dawn, licensed to an Australian subsidiary by noon, sub-licensed to a Dutch cooperative before sunset, and the profits land, clean and quiet, in a United States parent that now enjoys a 21% rate instead of 35%. The steps are legal, disclosed, even boring. The effect is the same. The tax is minimized, the wealth preserved, the brand unsullied. There will be no second Senate hearing. No one marches in the streets over a 15% minimum tax. The outrage cycle has moved on to artificial intelligence and facial recognition and labor conditions in cobalt mines. Apple issues flawless ESG reports, plants mangrove forests in Indonesia, promises carbon neutrality by 2030. The tax story is archived, a relic from the time when people still believed money could be trapped by borders. Yet something irreversible did happen. The secret became common knowledge. Every startup founder in San Francisco now knows that the real product is not the app, it is the profit flow. Every finance minister in Europe now understands that sovereignty over multinational corporations is an illusion unless the rules are global and the enforcement merciless. Every citizen who ever paid full tax on a modest salary knows, in some quiet corner of their mind, that the system was never blind. It simply looked the other way when the offender was brilliant enough. Apple never apologized because it never believed it did anything wrong. It obeyed the law as written. It hired the best minds to write better laws around it. It turned a bug in the code of globalization into the feature that made it the first $3 trillion company. And when the bug was finally patched, it rewrote its own source code before anyone else noticed the compiler had changed. This is not a story of crime. It is a story of mastery, of a company that understood the world's rules more deeply than the governments that created them. Of a fortune built not merely on beautiful devices, but on the even more beautiful realization that in the 21st century, information wants to be free, and capital wants to be stateless. The $250 billion was never hidden in the way a thief hides stolen cash. It was placed in plain view, inside the most transparent balance sheet in corporate history, labeled clearly as cash and marketable securities, visible to any analyst with a Bloomberg terminal. The hiding was conceptual, not physical. The money existed everywhere and nowhere, taxed by no one because no one could agree on where it belonged. And now, it belongs to Apple forever. Reinvested, distributed, compounded, immortal. The garage is gone. The dreamers have become the establishment. The revolution has been monetized, optimized, and shielded from every future revolution that might try to tax it. This is how an empire of untaxed billions ends. Not with a raid, not with handcuffs. Not with contrition. It ends with a soft chime as another iPhone ships, another share is repurchased, another patent is licensed across borders that no longer matter. The bill was never paid. It was simply rewritten.